She heard her husband negotiating her sale like cattle at market. 200 gold coins plus a bottle of whiskey. That was her worth to the men who claimed to own her. But when dawn broke over the endless prairie, she was gone. What happened next would transform a terrified runaway into a woman who chose fire over chains, wilderness over captivity, and a new name over the one that had made her a slave. If you're ready for a story of courage that will leave you breathless, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This journey is just beginning. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond their canvas walls, a sea of grass that whispered secrets Rachel had forgotten how to hear. She pressed her palm against the rough fabric, feeling the wind's desperate push against their makeshift home. Missouri felt like another lifetime, though only months had passed since Thomas had convinced her that leaving meant freedom. Freedom. The word tasted bitter now, like the coffee grounds Thomas insisted she brew twice to save money. Her wedding. Ring caught the lamplight, a thin band that had once promised salvation from her father's debts and her mother's disappointed sighs. Now it felt heavier than the iron shackles she'd seen on runaway slaves. Thomas's voice carried from outside, mingling with those of the other men who'd gathered around their fire. Their laughter was sharp, cutting through the evening air like broken glass. Rachel folded her hands in her lap, fingers tracing the worn fabric of her dress, the blue one he'd bought her in Kansas City, back when his touches still held tenderness instead of ownership. The canvas walls couldn't contain the weight of what she'd begun to understand. Every day brought new restrictions, new ways Thomas found to remind her that she belonged to him now. Body and breath and beating heart. The promises he'd made about their new life had crumbled like autumn leaves, leaving only the bitter truth beneath. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the girl who had once climbed apple trees and read poetry by candlelight. That girl had believed in love stories, in brave princes and happy endings. That girl had thought marriage meant partnership, not possession. Outside, the men's voices grew louder, their words becoming clearer. Rachel held her breath, though she knew she shouldn't listen, knew that hearing would only make the cage feel smaller. She's strong stock, Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the same tone he used when discussing the horses. Good hips for breeding. Knows her way around a kitchen. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, pressing hard against her lips to keep any sound from escaping. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. What you asking for her? The voice belonged to Clem Morrison, a man whose eyes followed Rachel with the same hunger she'd seen in wolves circling wounded deer. 200 in gold, plus a bottle of that Kentucky whiskey you've been hoarding. The world tilted. Rachel gripped the edge of their rough wooden table, her knuckles white as bone. The blue dress suddenly felt like burial clothes. That's mighty steep. For used goods, Morrison laughed, and the sound made Rachel's skin crawl. But I reckon she'd clean up nice. Been thinking I need a woman to warm my bed and tend my affairs. She's well trained, Thomas continued as if she were a horse he was breaking. Quiet, obedient, won't give you no trouble. The conversation continued, each word falling like stones into still water, sending ripples through Rachel's understanding of everything she'd thought she knew about her life. Thomas wasn't just tired of her. He was selling her, trading her like cattle at market. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small bundle of belongings she kept hidden beneath their shared mattress. The packet contained her mother's pearl earrings, her grandmother's Bible, and $17 she'd saved by skimping on household supplies. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The men outside were shaking hands now, their deals sealed with the casual ease of merchants discussing grain prices. Rachel pressed her face against the canvas and watched Thomas pocket Morrison's gold coins, the same hands that had once caressed her face, now counting the price of her body. She thought of the Cheyenne territory they'd crossed to reach this place, the vast emptiness that had terrified her then, but now called to her like a prayer. The prairie had seemed so hostile during their journey west, but now she understood that the real wilderness existed within the walls men built to contain women. As the group dispersed, each man returning to his own fire and his own plans, Rachel made her own bargain with the darkness. She would not be sold. She would not be passed from hand to hand like a piece of property. She would walk into that prairie, wilderness, before she would walk into another man's cage. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the grass. Rachel gathered her few possessions and prepared to discover what lay beyond the reach of men who believed they could own the wind. The grass was taller than she'd imagined, reaching past her waist in some places, creating a living maze that swallowed her footsteps. Rachel moved through it like a ghost, each step taking her further from the fading glow of the camp's fires and deeper into a world that belonged to no man. Her feet found their own rhythm against the earth, a steady pulse that matched her heartbeat. The blue dress caught on thorns and tall stems, but she didn't stop to free it carefully. Let it tear, let it fray. It was Thomas's dress anyway, bought with Thomas's money, chosen for Thomas's pleasure. The night air carried scents she'd never noticed from inside the canvas walls, sage and sweet grass, earth still warm from the day's sun, and something wilder, something that spoke of places where no plows had turned the soil. Her lungs expanded, drawing in breath that tasted of freedom and fear in equal measure. Behind her, the camp grew smaller until it was just another star in the darkness. Rachel didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Looking back was a luxury for people who had somewhere to return to. Her mother's pearl earrings swayed with each step. The only jewelry she'd kept besides the wedding ring, she'd already slipped from her finger and dropped somewhere in the grass. Let some coyote find it and wonder at the strange circular thing that bound nothing to nothing. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time moved differently out here, measured not by clocks, but by the slow wheel of constellations overhead. Rachel's legs began to shake, her city-soft feet protesting against the rough ground. But she pressed, Zon driven by the knowledge that Morrison would comfort her at first light, expecting to find his purchase, waiting meekly in Thomas's tent. The thought of Morrison's hands on her body, his breath on her neck, gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Better to collapse in this ocean of grass, to submit to another cage, another set of walls built from masculine certainty and feminine surrender. A creek's whisper reached her ears, growing stronger as she stumbled toward the sound. Water meant life, meant she might survive until morning. Rachel pushed through a final curtain of grass and saw moonlight dancing on the surface of a narrow stream. She fell to her knees at the water's edge, cupping the cold liquid in her palms and drinking deeply. It tasted of minerals and distance, of places beyond maps and territories beyond claiming. For the first time in months, Rachel felt something approaching peace. The exhaustion hit her all at once, as if her body had been waiting for this moment, of relative safety to acknowledge its limits. She curled up beside the stream, using her bundled petticoat as a pillow, and let the sound of moving water carry her toward dreams of wide skies and roads that led anywhere but back. Dawn came like a gentle fever, warming Rachel's face and drawing her from dreams of flying over endless grass. She woke with the sun already climbing the eastern sky, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. The stream beside her caught the light and threw it back in shimmering fragments, each ripple a tiny celebration of morning. For a moment she forgot where she was and why. Then memory crashed over her like cold water. Thomas Morrison. The price of her flesh counted out in gold coins. Rachel sat up quickly, scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Instead, she found herself looking at a man. He sat motionless on a painted horse, perhaps 50 yards downstream, watching her with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Even at this distance, she could see the strong lines of his face. The way he held himself like someone who belonged to this vast landscape instead of trying to conquer it. Rachel's first instinct was to run, but her legs were still weak from the night's flight. Her second instinct was to scream, but something in the man's stillness made her reconsider. He wasn't moving toward her or away from her. He was simply there like a tree or a boulder, part of the morning itself. Slowly she got to her feet, her torn dress clinging to her legs, her hair escaping its pins in wild tangles. She must look. Like a madwoman, a scarecrow escaped from some farmer's field. But the man on the horse didn't seem afraid or amused. He watched her with eyes that held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Curiosity rather than ownership. "You are lost," he said finally, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. His English was careful, precise, touched, with an accent that spoke of another language held just beneath the surface. Rachel opened her mouth to deny it, then realized the truth was too obvious to hide. She was lost in every way that mattered. Lost in geography, lost in purpose, lost in the space between who she had been and who she might become. "Yes," she said instead, the word falling into the morning air like a stone into still water. The man dismounted, moving with fluid grace. His horse, a Pinto Mariara with intelligent eyes, followed without need for rope or command. As he walked closer, Rachel could see the beadwork on his shirt, the way his dark hair caught the light, the careful way he moved so as not to frighten her. "There are men looking for you," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. Men with horses and guns and anger in their hearts. Rachel's breath caught. "How many?" "3. They speak of ownership and theft, as if you were a horse that had wandered from their pasture." His eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her heart skip. Not pity, not desire, but recognition. But horses do not choose to wander. People do. He extended his hand not to grab or claim, but in invitation. "I am Nakawa, and you have a choice to make." Rachel stared at the outstretched hand, brown and strong and patient. It held no rings, no symbols of ownership or authority, just calluses that spoke of work and weapons and fingers that waited without grasping. "What choice?" she asked, though part of her already knew. The question hummed in the space between them like a prayer half-spoken. "You can return to them," Nakoa said, his voice steady as the stream beside them. "They will find you regardless. Morrison has claimed purchase, and your husband," he said the word like it tasted strange, "has accepted payment. In their eyes the transaction is complete." Rachel flinched. Hearing it stated so plainly made the reality cut deeper, sharper than the thorns that had torn her dress during the night's flight. "Or," she whispered, "or you choose to live." Nakoa's hand remained extended, patient as stone. "But if you choose life, you cannot go back. You will walk away from everything you were, everything they named you. You will learn to be someone else entirely." The morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long and dark across the grass. Rachel could hear her heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Behind Nakoa, his horse waited with the same patient stillness, as if she too understood the gravity of the moment. "What would happen to me?" Rachel asked. "If I choose to live? You would learn to survive, to read the land, to understand the seasons, to find water and shelter and safety." Nakoa's eyes held hers steadily. "You would learn to be strong in ways your people do not teach their women. Your people, the Cheyenne. We have words for women like you, women who have walked through fire and kept walking. We have places for such women, roles that do not involve ownership or sale." Rachel thought of the Cheyenne warriors she'd glimpsed during their westward journey, the way Thomas and the other men had spoken of them with mixture of fear and contempt. Savage, they'd called them, univilized. But looking at Nakoa now, she saw nothing savage in his patience, nothing universalized in his offer of choice. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" Nakoa was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something deeper than sympathy. Because no person should be sold like a horse. Because the strong should protect those who seek strength. Because the prairie is wide enough for all who have the courage to walk it freely. Rachel looked down at her torn dress, her bare feet already cut from stones and thorns. She thought of Morrison's hungry eyes, of Thomas counting gold coins, of the tent that had been her cage and would be her tomb if she returned. Then she thought, of sky, endless sky, stretching in all directions, belonging to no one and everyone. Sky that had no walls, no boundaries, no price tags hanging from its clouds. She reached out and took Nakoa's hand. Nakoa's horse accepted Rachel's presence with the same calm patience as her rider. The mare's name was Ayana, he told her, as he helped her up behind him, and she had carried him safely for 7 winters. Rachel wrapped her arms around Nakoa's waist and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid warmth of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. They rode north, following deer paths and stream beds, routes that existed in harmony with the land rather than carved against it. Rachel had expected speed, desperate flight from her pursuers, but Nakoa set a measured pace that spoke of confidence rather than fear. "They will follow," he said when she asked about Thomas and Morrison, "but they follow with anger, not wisdom. Anger makes men careless, predictable. We will be where they do not think to look." The sun climbed higher as they traveled, transforming the morning coolness into something warmer, more alive. Rachel felt her city-softened muscles protesting the unfamiliar position, but she didn't complain. Discomfort was a small price for the growing sense of space around her, the feeling that each mile took her further from everything that had tried to own her. "Tell me about your name," Nakoa said, as they paused at a shallow creek to let Ayana drink. "The one they gave you." "Rachel." The word felt strange in her mouth, like a garment that no longer fit properly. "It means you, I think, a female sheep." Nakoa nodded thoughtfully. "Names have power. They shape how others see us, how we see ourselves. A sheep's name for a sheep's life, owned, guided, eventually slaughtered for someone else's benefit." The brutal honesty of it made Rachel wooze, but she couldn't deny the truth. Her entire life had been a series of pastures, each one promising safety while slowly limiting her movement. Her father's house, then Thomas's tent, then Morrison's bed. Each transition, just another gate closing behind her. "What does your name mean?" she asked. "Fearless warrior." Nakoa's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile, though I was quite afraid of lightning as a child. Names are not always prophecies, but sometimes they become them if we live into them long enough. They remounted and continued north, the landscape gradually changing around them. The grass grew shorter here, interrupted by patches of sage and scattered wildflowers Rachel couldn't name. The horizon seemed to expand with each mile, offering possibilities she'd never imagined. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To my grandmother's winter camp. She is a medicine woman, a keeper of old wisdom. She will know what to do with you." Rachel felt a flutter of anxiety. What if she doesn't want me there? What if she sees me as an outsider, an enemy? Nakoa was quiet for a moment, guiding Ayana around a cluster of prairie dog mounds. "My grandmother has eyes that see truth beneath surfaces. She will look at you and see not where you came from, but where you are going." The confidence in his voice steadied her, but Rachel still felt the weight of her uncertainty. She was fleeing toward people who had every reason to distrust her, carrying nothing but determination and the clothes on her back. What did she have to offer in return for sanctuary? As if reading her thoughts, Nakoa spoke again. "You asked why I help you. Now I ask, why do you accept help?" What makes you willing to ride into unknown territory with a stranger? Rachel considered the question, watching the endless grass flow past them like a green ocean. Because unknown territory is better than known captivity, she said finally. Because a stranger who offers choice is kinder than a husband who offers none. Good, Nakawa said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. Remember that feeling. You will need it in the days ahead. They made camp that evening beside a natural windbreak of sandstone formations that rose from the prairie like ancient monuments. Nakawa showed Rachel how to gather dry grass for tinder, how to find the driest wood for their small fire, how to arrange stones to reflect heat and hide light from unwanted eyes. The earth speaks constantly, he said, kneeling beside a patch of disturbed ground. Most people have forgotten how to listen. Rachel knelt beside him, trying to see what he saw in the seemingly random arrangement of soil and stone. To her eyes, it looked like nothing more than dirt. Here, Nikawa pointed to a barely visible depression in the earth, rabbit trail used regularly, and here his finger traced a line of compressed grass. Deer came to water this morning, early before the sun rose high. Gradually, Rachel began to see it. The landscape wasn't empty, but filled with stories written in tracks and scat, bent stems and disturbed earth. Every creature that passed left its signature for those who knew how to read the ancient script. Why is this important? She asked. Because knowledge keeps you alive. Understanding your environment means understanding your options. Nakawa stood brushing earth from his hands. Your people see the prairie as empty space to be crossed or conquered. We see it as a living thing, with moods and messages, gifts and warnings. As if to prove his point, he led her to a patch of plants she'd walked past without noticing. Yarrow, he said, touching the feathery leaves, good for healing cuts and stopping bleeding. And this, he indicated, a cluster of purple flowers. Wild. Bergamot. It will ease stomach sickness and make tea that soothes the throat. Rachel tried to memorize the shapes and colors, the subtle differences that distinguished medicine from mere weeds. Her hands, soft from a life of indoor work, felt clumsy as she practiced identifying the plants Nakawa showed her. I'm not good at this, she said after confusing yarrow with a similar-looking but useless plant for the third time. You're learning, Nakawa corrected. That's different from being good. Being good comes later, after your hands have touched. 1,000 plants and your eyes have learned to see what matters. They ate dried meat and berries as the sun set, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Rachel felt her body beginning to adapt to this new rhythm, sleeping when darkness came, waking with the light, moving in harmony with the natural world instead of fighting against it. Tomorrow I will teach you to make a walking stick, Nakawa said as they banked the fire for the night, and to cut trail markers, signs that will help you find your way if you become separated from those who know the paths. Are you planning to abandon me? Rachel asked, and was surprised by how much the possibility frightened her. I am planning to ensure you can survive abandonment, Nakawa replied. There is a difference. One is cruelty, the other is kindness. Rachel wrapped herself in the spare blanket he'd given her and settled against the warm stone. Above them, stars emerged like scattered diamonds, more brilliant than any she'd ever seen through the canvas walls of Thomas's tent. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear of what morning might bring. The third day brought revelation in the form of smoke on the horizon. Rachel saw it first, a thin, dark line rising from the southeast, and pointed it out to Nakawa as they crested a low hill. He studied it with the intensity of someone reading vital news, his face growing grim. They burned the grass behind them, he said finally, to erase their trail or to signal others. Thomas, perhaps, or other searchers. Nakawa turned Ayana toward a cluster of cottonwoods that marked another stream. We will rest here and decide how to proceed, but rest was impossible for Rachel. The smoke felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, a reminder that her past hadn't simply vanished with her decision to flee. It pursued her with the persistence of a hunting pack, patient and relentless. As Nico tended to his horse, Rachel walked to the stream's edge and stared at her reflection in the slow-moving water. The face that looked back was barely recognizable. Hair tangled and sun-darkened, skin already showing the effects of wind and weather. Eyes that held something she'd never seen there before. What was it? Not just fear or determination, though. Both were present. Something deeper. Something that seemed to glow from within like banked coals waiting for wind. "You see it now," Nakoa said, appearing beside her without sound. "See what?" "The fire that lives inside you, the one they tried to extinguish but could not." Rachel touched her reflection, watching the ripples distort her features. "I don't feel fired. I feel frightened and lost." "And fire does not always roar," Nakoa interrupted gently. "Sometimes it burns steady and quiet, warming those who need warmth, lighting the way for those who walk in darkness. Your fire kept you alive. When they tried to buy and sell you like meat, it will keep you alive now." The smoke on the horizon had grown thicker, more ominous. Rachel found herself wondering if Thomas was down there somewhere, cursing her name and plotting her recapture. Did he see her flight as theft of his property, or as something more personal, a rejection of his authority that demanded punishment? "I never fought back before," she said suddenly. "Never once. When my father arranged my marriage to pay his debts, I accepted it. When Thomas showed his true nature, I endured it. When he talked about selling me, I ran, yes, but I never thought to fight." "Running was fighting," Nakoa said. "Choosing life over submission was fighting. You fought with the only weapon you had, your refusal to surrender." Rachel thought about this as they broke camp and continued north, the smoke growing smaller behind them, but never quite disappearing. Something was shifting inside her, a fundamental change in how she understood her own story. She'd always seen herself as acted upon a character in other people's stories, but fleeing Thomas, accepting Nakoa's help, choosing the uncertainty of the prairie over the certainty of sail. These were acts of authorship, ways of writing her own narrative. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. If she was the author of her own story, then she was also responsible for its direction, its conflicts, its resolution. No one else would save her or damn her. The choice, as Nakoa had said, was entirely her own. That evening, as they camped beneath a canopy of stars, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for tomorrow, not fear of what it might bring, but curiosity about what she might choose to make of it. The fire inside her, banked but not extinguished, began to burn a little brighter. On the fourth morning, the hunters found them. Rachel woke to Nakoa's hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but urgent. She opened her eyes to see him crouched beside her, finger pressed to his lips in the universal gesture for silence. Dawn was still an hour away, but something in the quality of darkness had changed. "How many?" she whispered. "3 riders approaching from the south. They move without stealth, as if they believe themselves the only hunters in this territory." Rachel's blood turned to ice water. Thomas Morrison and likely Jeremiah Fletcher, Morrison's partner in various unsavory enterprises. Men who saw her flight not as an assertion of human dignity, but as theft of rightfully purchased property. Nakoa was already moving efficiently, gathering their few possessions and preparing Ayana for quick travel. But even as he worked, Rachel could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. They were outnumbered, and while Nakoa was clearly comfortable with the prospect of violence, Rachel wasn't sure she could live with the consequences of blood spilled on her behalf. "Let me go to them," she said suddenly. Noah froze. A bridle, half fastened in his hands. "What? If I surrender myself, they'll have what they came for. You won't have to. She gestured helplessly, unable to voice her fear that he might die protecting her. No. The word was flat, final, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. But if they take me back, they will not take you back. Nakar finished preparing Ayana and turned to face Rachel fully. In the pre-dawn darkness, his face was all shadows and sharp angles, but his voice held steady conviction. You have chosen life. I will not allow you to choose death merely because it seems easier. Rachel felt tears, threatening, a mixture of gratitude and terror, and something else she couldn't name. I don't want you to be hurt because of me, and I do not want you to be hurt because of them. Nakoa swung himself onto Ayana's back and extended his hand to Rachel. We are not surrendering, we are continuing forward. As they rode north through the pre-dawn darkness, Rachel found herself thinking about the nature of protection. Thomas had promised to protect her from her father's creditors, from spinsterhood, from the uncertainty of an unmarried woman's life. But his protection had been a cage, his safety a form of slow suffocation. Nakoa's protection felt different, not like walls closing around her, but like space opening up. He wasn't sheltering her from the world, but helping her learn to navigate. The distinction seemed crucial, though she couldn't yet articulate why. Behind them, barely visible in the growing light, 3 dark figures moved across the prairie, with the grim persistence of men who believed themselves entitled to their pursuit. Rachel pressed her face against Nakoa's back and tried not to think about what would happen if they were caught. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of Ayana's movement, the gradual lightening of the sky, the way the prairie seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Somewhere ahead lay Nakoa's grandmother, the medicine woman who might offer sanctuary. Somewhere behind lay her former life, pursuing her with all the vindictive certainty of men who could not accept that what they believed they owned might choose to own itself. Between past and future, Rachel rode toward a confrontation she couldn't avoid and couldn't predict. But for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't riding toward it alone. The confrontation came at midday, in a shallow valley where a creek wound between low hills dotted with sage. Nakoa had hoped to reach his grandmother's camp before their pursuers caught up. But Ayana was carrying double weight, while their horses were fresh and driven by fury. Thomas's voice carried across the valley like a whip crack. That's far enough, boy. You got something that belongs to me. Rachel felt Nakoa's muscles tense beneath her arms, but he didn't reach for the rifle across his saddle or the knife at his belt. Instead, he guided Ayana around to face their pursuers, placing himself between Rachel and the 3 mounted men who had ridden them down. Thomas sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to take what he wanted. Morrison flanked him on the left, his small eyes bright with anticipation. On the right, Jeremiah Fletcher kept one hand rested casually on his pistol grip, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. "She ain't property to be stolen," Nakoa said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The hell she ain't. Paid good money for her. Got the marriage certificate to prove ownership. You savages might not understand legal documents, but they mean something to civilized folk." Rachel felt something ignite in her chest, a sudden flare of anger so pure it took her breath away, not at being claimed she'd expected that, but at the casual way Thomas dismissed Nakoa, reducing him to a stereotype that justified whatever violence they planned to commit. Before she could think, before fear could stop her, Rachel was sliding down from Ayana's back. "Rachel, no," Nakoa said sharply, but she was already walking toward Thomas, her torn dress fluttering in the prairie wind. "You want to talk about ownership?" she called, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "Let's talk about it, Thomas. Let's talk about how you own things." Thomas's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected submission, tears, pleas, for mercy. He hadn't expected her to meet his eyes or speak with the clear, ringing tone of someone who had nothing left to lose. "You own a horse," Rachel continued, stopping just out of his reach. "You own a saddle, a rifle, whatever, Gold Morrison. Paid. You for the privilege of raping me in his bed instead of yours." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Fletcher's hand tightened on his weapon. "But you never owned me, Thomas, not my thoughts, not my dreams, not the part of me that chose to walk away from your plans to sell me like a broodmare." Rachel's voice grew, stronger with each word. "You owned a marriage certificate, you owned my fear, you owned my silence, but you never owned me." Thomas's face had gone dark with anger. "You ungrateful." "I walked away from you," Rachel continued, cutting him off. "Not in defeat, not in shame. I walked away in flames, Thomas. I walked away burning with the knowledge that I was never yours to sell. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the grass and the nervous shifting of horses." Rachel could feel the power of her words hanging in the air like smoke, changing the shape of the confrontation in ways none of them had anticipated. Behind her, she heard Nakoa's quiet voice. "She has chosen. The choice is sacred, even to those who do not honor sacred things." Thomas's hand moved toward his gun, but Fletcher caught his wrist. "Tom," he said quietly, "think about this. 3 against 1 are decent odds, but that one's Cheyenne. They don't fight like us. They fight to win." For a long moment, the tableau held. Rachel standing alone in the grass, Nakoa mounted and watchful behind her. 3 men on horses calculating the cost of their claimed prize. Then Thomas spat in the dirt and turned his horse away. "Keep her." Then he snarled. "Ain't no civilized man going to want her after she's been with a savage anyway. She's spoiled goods now, worthless as weak old meat." Rachel watched them ride away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, finally learning to fly. She had spoken her truth to the men who had tried to buy and sell her, and she was still standing, still breathing, still choosing her own direction. Nakoa rode up beside her, his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "Fire walked," he said softly. "What it is. What we call women who have passed through flame and kept walking. Women who have faced their greatest fear and discovered it could not consume them." He extended his hand to help her back onto Ayana. "How you a firewalk now, Rachel?" Who was? "The question is, who will you choose to become?" Nakoa's grandmother lived in a camp of 6 lodges set in a grove of cottonwoods beside a clear running stream. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the voices of women preparing the evening meal. It looked, Rachel thought, like peace itself made manifest in hide and wood and daily ritual. The old woman emerged from the largest lodge as they approached, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers, her face creased by years and weather into a map of lived experience. She studied Rachel with eyes that seemed to see through flesh, hand bone to something deeper. "Grandmother," Nakoa said, dismounting and helping Rachel down, "I bring you a firewalker." The old woman, whose name Rachel learned was Mapi, meaning sky, circled her slowly, taking in her torn dress, her sun-darkened skin, the new straightness in her posture that spoke of recent transformation. "What was your name in the world of cages?" MP asked, her English accented but clear. "Rachel, and what does this name mean?" "You, female sheep." MP nodded thoughtfully. "A name chosen by those who wished you to be docile, easily led, valuable only for what you could produce for others." She stopped directly in front of Rachel, close enough that their eyes were level. "But sheep do not walk through fire. Sheep do not choose prairie over pasture. What name will you choose for yourself?" The question hung in the air like incense, rich with possibility. Rachel realized that this was the moment Nakoa had been preparing her for, not just escape from her old life, but conscious creation of a new one. The choice of name was a choice of identity, of the story she would tell about herself from this day forward. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never named myself before." Mappy smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something luminous. "Then you will live among us until you do know. You will learn our ways, perform our work, share our responsibilities, and when you have discovered who you are beneath the layers of who others wanted you to be, you will speak your true name and we will recognize it." That evening, the camp gathered around the central fire to hear Rachel's story. She told it simply, without embellishment or self-pity. The arranged marriage, the gradual understanding of Thomas's nature, the night she heard herself being sold, the decision to flee rather than submit. When she finished, the circle was quiet. For a long moment, then Ma spoke. "You have walked the path that separates those who accept their circumstances from those who create their circumstances. This is not an easy path. Many who begin it turn back before reaching its end." An older man introduced as Mab's brother added his voice to the discussion. "There will be resistance. Your former people will not easily accept your transformation. They will try to reclaim you, to force you back into the shape they found useful." Rachel nodded. She'd expected this, had seen the rage in Thomas's eyes when she'd spoken her truth. "What can I do to prepare?" "Learn," said a woman with kind eyes, "and strong hands. Learn to feed yourself, to shelter yourself, to defend yourself. Learn to be useful to this community, not as property, but as person. Learn to think like someone who belongs to herself." Over the following days, Rachel began her education in earnest. She learned to tan hides and sew with sinew, to preserve meat and gather medicines, to read weather patterns and animal behavior. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic servitude, grew calloused and capable. Her muscles, weakened by inactivity and poor nutrition, began to strengthen. But the most important learning was less tangible. She was studying a new way of being woman. Not as adjunct to man, but as complete person, not as property, but as participant, not as sheep, but as something wilder and infinitely more complex. At night, lying in the lodge MP had assigned her, Rachel would test names in her mind, like trying on different garments. None felt right yet, but she could sense her true name forming somewhere deep inside her, waiting for the moment when she was ready to speak it aloud. It came to her on a morning 6 weeks after her arrival, as she knelt by the stream, washing clothes and watching the sun paint the water gold. The name rose from someplace deeper than thought, carrying with it the weight of absolute recognition. Tioka, she who brings happiness. Rachel, for she was still Rachel in that moment, sat back, on her heels, and let the name settle into her bones. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never seen, but always known existed, like finding a key to a door she'd been trying to open her entire life. She was no longer the you, the docile creature whose value lay in her usefulness to others. She was the bringer of happiness, not as service or performance, but as essential nature. Her joy was her own to give or withhold, her happiness a gift she chose to share, rather than a duty she was required to perform. That evening she asked me to convene the naming circle. The ceremony was simple, but profound. Rachel stood in the center of the gathered community and spoke her chosen name 3 times, each repetition stronger than the last. Then Mai placed her hands on Rachel's shoulders and spoke the words that made the transformation official. Rachel, who was, is no more. A yoka walks among us now, firewalked and free, belonging to herself, and choosing to belong also to us. The circle erupted in celebration, singing and drumming that carried across the prairie like a proclamation of joy. Ayoka felt the music enter her bones, felt her new name settle into her soul like a seed finding perfect soil. Later, As the celebration continued around them, Nakoa found her sitting by the stream, looking up at the stars. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the grassy bank. Ayoka considered the question carefully. Did she regret leaving the life she'd known, the security of walls and ceilings and predictable days? Did she regret the comfort of being told what to do, what to think, what to want? No, she said finally, and meant it completely. No regrets, only gratitude for what? For the morning you found me by this stream, for the choice you offered, for showing me that there was another way to live. She turned to look at him. This man who had appeared in her darkest hour, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. "So you saved my life, Nakoa." He shook his head gently. "I offered you tools. You saved your own life by choosing to use them." Ayoka thought about this, about the distinction between being saved and saving oneself. It seemed important, though she wasn't sure she understood all the implications yet. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you live," Nakoa said simply. "You wake each morning and choose who to be that day. You learn and grow and contribute to this community that has claimed you as family. You become whoever Ayoka is meant to become." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, writing stories across the darkness in languages older than human speech. Ayoka felt herself part of something vast and timeless, connected not just to the people around her, but to the earth itself, to the sky, to the endless possibilities contained in each new dawn. She was no longer waiting for someone else to write her story. She was writing it herself, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to see what came next. By autumn, Ayoka had begun construction of her own lodge. The work was slow, deliberate, each element chosen and placed with the conscious intent of someone creating not just shelter, but symbol. This was to be her first home, the first space that belonged entirely to her. MPI helped her select the location, a slight rise overlooking the stream positioned to catch the morning sun and shelter from winter winds. The other women taught her the complex techniques of hide preparation and frame construction, but they let her make the decisions about design and decoration. Ayoka chose to mark her lodge with symbols of fire and roots, flames carved into the wooden supports, root patterns burned into the hide covering. When asked about the meaning, she explained that the flames represented her journey through fire, while the roots spoke of her commitment to growing deep in this new soil. The work occupied her hands, while her mind processed the deeper changes occurring within her. Each morning brought small revelations about who she was becoming. She discovered she had a gift for reading weather patterns, for sensing when storms approached hours before they became visible. She found she could gentle frightened horses with nothing more than patience and steady presence. Most surprisingly, she learned she had a talent for storytelling, for taking the experiences of her former life and transforming them into narratives that helped other women understand their own situations. Word of the fire-walked woman spread among the scattered Cheyenne bands. Women began arriving at MP's camp, some fleeing situations similar to Ayoka's, others simply curious about the white woman who had chosen Cheyenne life over her own people's customs. Each visitor left changed by conversations with Ayoka, and each visit left Ayoka more certain of her purpose. She was becoming a bridge between worlds, a translator of experiences that crossed cultural boundaries. Her story of transformation resonated with women regardless of their background, offering proof that radical change was possible for those brave enough to choose it. One evening, as she worked on sewing designs into her lodge covering, Nakoa approached carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. "A gift," he said, settling beside her in the comfortable way they developed over the months of friendship. "For your new home." Ayoka unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a pair of silver earrings worked with intricate Cheyenne designs. They were beautiful, but more than that, they represented acceptance, a formal acknowledgement of her place in the community. "They're perfect," she said, removing the pearl earrings she'd worn since leaving Missouri and replacing them with Nakoa's gift. The pearls went into her medicine bundle, not discarded, but transformed from daily wear to treasured memory. "There's something else," Nakoa said, his voice carrying a note she'd never heard before. "Something I need to tell you." Ayoka looked up from admiring the earrings, noting the unusual tension in his posture. "When I found you by the stream that morning, it was not by accident," he said carefully. "I had been tracking your husband's party for 3 days, waiting for an opportunity to intervene." "Intervene how?" "We had heard of Thomas Sinclair's activities, his habit of acquiring women through marriage and then selling them to other men. The tribal council decided he represented a threat that needed addressing." Nakoa met her eyes steadily. "I was sent to stop him." Ayoka absorbed this information, understanding suddenly that her rescue had been part of a larger pattern of protection and justice. "You would have killed him if necessary, but when I saw you by the stream, saw you had already chosen to save yourself, I realized there was a better way." Nakoa's voice softened. "Justice served not through violence but through transformation, not just stopping one man's evil, but creating something good to counterbalance it." The revelation recontextualized everything Ayoka thought she understood. About her rescue, she hadn't simply stumbled into salvation. She had walked into the middle of a planned intervention, her flight aligning perfectly with Nakoa's mission. "Does it change anything?" Nakoa asked, clearly concerned about her reaction. "Knowing that your rescue was planned," Ayoka considered, this turning the new understanding over in her mind, like a stone in her palm. Did it diminish her agency to learn that help had already been on the way? Did it make her transformation less authentic? "No," she said finally. "You offered me choice. That's what mattered. Not whether you came looking for me or found me by accident, but what you did when you found me." She smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "You could have rescued me and returned me to my father. You could have killed Thomas and left me stranded. Instead, you offered me the chance to become myself. That was gift, not accident." Relief flickered across Nakoa's features. "I was afraid. You would feel manipulated. I feel grateful," Ayoka said simply. "And I feel ready to finish my lodge so I can start my real life inside it." As winter approached, Ayoka's home neared completion. It would be small but sufficient, decorated with symbols of her journey, but built for the future she was creating, one conscious choice at a time. She was no longer becoming someone. She was someone fully realized and continuously growing, rooted in the earth of her own choosing. Spring brought visitors Ayoka had not expected to see again. She was working in her garden, herbs and vegetables she'd learned to cultivate using Cheyenne techniques, when Mappy approached with an expression of carefully controlled emotion. "There are men at the edge of camp," the old woman said. "White men they asked to speak with the woman they call Rachel Sinclair." Ayoka felt her breath catch, but not with the old fear. This was different. Anticipation rather than terror, curiosity rather than dread. She had wondered if this moment would come, and now that it had, she found herself ready for it. Thomas stood with 2 men she didn't recognize, all of them looking uncomfortable and out of place among the lodges and cooking fires. He held a leather folder in his hands, legal documents, she assumed, marriage certificates and property claims. That meant nothing here, but still held power in the world beyond the prairie. "Rachel," he said when he saw her approaching, and she heard the uncertainty in his voice. This was not the broken woman he'd expected to find. This was someone he didn't recognize, someone who moved with confidence and belonged clearly to the place she inhabited. "My name is Ayoka," she replied calmly. "Rachel is a name from another life." Thomas gestured impatiently. Don't matter what you call yourself. You're still my legal wife, still my responsibility. I've come to take you home. This is my home." Ayoka gestured to the lodge she'd built, the garden she'd planted, the community that had gathered to witness this encounter. "I have no other." One of the men with Thomas stepped forward, a lawyer from his dress and manner. "Mrs. Sinclair, I understand you may have been confused by your experiences here, but the law is clear. Your husband has legal claim to your person and property. If you return willingly, no charges will be brought against those who aided your disappearance." Ayoka felt the threat implicit in his words, the suggestion that her refusal to comply would bring violence down on those who had welcomed her. But she also felt the circle of her community around her, their silent support giving her strength. "I am not property to be claimed," she said clearly. "I am a person who has chosen her life consciously and completely. No law you recognize can change that truth." Thomas's face darkened with familiar anger. "You're my wife, bought and paid for. That savages is what you are now, but you're still mine by law." The words were meant to wound, to reduce her to shame and submission. Instead, they clarified something for Ayoka that had been forming in her mind for months. "I was never bought," she said, stepping closer to Thomas, close enough that he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. "You bartered with my father for the right to control me, but you never owned me. You possessed my fear, my silence, my compliance, but never me." She gestured to the life she'd built around her. "This is what ownership looks like. Not possession of another person, but possession of oneself. I own my choices, my work, my relationships, my future. I own my name and my story and my right to live them as I see fit." The lawyer tried another approach. "The law, your law," Ayoka interrupted, "not mine. I live now under laws that recognize a woman's right to self-determination, laws that judge a person's worth by their character rather than their usefulness to others." Thomas was growing desperate, his control of the situation slipping away. You can't just disappear. There are consequences, legal ramifications." "Yes," Ayoka agreed. "There are consequences. The consequence is that I am happy. The consequence is that I wake each morning grateful for the life I've chosen. The consequence is that I am no longer afraid of you or any man who believes he can buy a woman's soul along with her obedience." She turned to address the lawyer directly. "You may have legal documents that claim authority over someone named Rachel Sinclair, but Rachel Sinclair no longer exists. She walked into fire and emerged as someone else entirely. Your papers are meaningless because the person they describe has died and been reborn." The confrontation continued for another hour. Thomas and his representatives becoming increasingly frustrated as every legal argument broke against Ayoka's quiet certainty. Finally, recognizing the futility of their mission, they departed with threats of return and promises of consequences that sounded hollow even to them. As their horses disappeared into the distance, Ayoka felt the final chain of her former bondage snap and fall away. She was free, not just in practice, but in her own understanding, no longer defined by what she had escaped, but by what she had chosen to become. That evening, as the community gathered around the fire to celebrate another successful resistance to outside interference, Ayoka found herself thinking about circles, how her journey had brought her back to a confrontation with her past, but from a position of strength rather than weakness. She was no longer the woman who had fled Thomas's tent in terror. She was Ayoka, firewalked and free, belonging to herself and choosing each day how to live that belonging. She was the woman who had walked through flames and kept walking, who had discovered that the prairie was wide enough to contain all the dreams she'd never dared to dream. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and Ayoka felt herself part of something vast and purposeful and good. She had been born twice, once into the world of others' expectations, and once into the world of her own choosing. The second birth, she reflected, had been infinitely more difficult and infinitely more worthwhile. Under the watching stars, surrounded by the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return, Ayoka settled into the deep contentment of a woman who had never been owned. Not by man, not by fear, not by anything except the fire that had kept her alive and walking toward the life she was meant to